Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher. Welcome to Sweetwater's Guitars and Gear. This time out, a super versatile tool for using your amplifiers in the studio and on stage. Let's get started. Today we're checking out the Boss Waza Tube Amp Expander, which is this box right here on top of the Marshall amplifier beside me. Tube amps like this Marshall amp beside me are awesome for a lot of different applications. They sound incredible, they have lots of power for use on stage, they provide lots of tone, but they also come with some limitations. For example, with this Plexi style Marshall, there's no master volume. So basically you crank up the gain until it gets the tone that you want, and you live with the volume that it produces. And often that's just too loud, especially for practicing at home, for rehearsal, or for small venues. That's where the Boss Waza Tube Amp Expander comes in. It controls the volume coming out of the amplifier and also provides a lot of different functions for us. Let's take a tour. First of all, let's talk about how you hook the Waza Tube Amp Expander up. We're coming out of the speaker output of our Marshall into the back of the unit. Then there's a speaker output from the Waza Tube Amp Expander that's coming down to our 4x12. What happens is the speaker level signal from the Marshall, which comes after the power amp, so we have all that harmonic content that comes from the power amp as well as the preamp, comes into the Waza Tube Amp Expander. Now the first thing it sees is what's called a reactive load. A reactive load emulates what happens when an amplifier is plugged straight into a speaker. There's actually two-way communication there. The reactive load does the same thing for us, and what's special about the Waza Tube Amp Expander is we can set that reactive load to the type of speaker cabinet that we're using. So for example, using these two knobs, we could dial in a reactive load setting for a 1x12 cabinet. Or in this case, I've got it set up for a classic 4x12 cabinet. That makes it feel very natural, and it makes the amplifier think that it's plugged straight into a speaker. And again, that gives us very natural response. The actual amplification, or the volume that we're hearing, is coming from a built-in power amp inside the Waza Tube Amp Expander. This is a transparent power amp, so what it's doing is just making the tone that's coming from our amplifier louder and then driving the speaker cabinet. There are 100 watts of power available inside, and we control that using the volume knob over here, the speaker output knob. This allows us to set the volume level extremely low, so we can practice at whisper quiet volumes at home, or we can crank it up to the full 100 watts if we're on a loud stage. This also allows for silent recording if we're working in the studio. We simply turn the speaker output totally off, nothing feeds out to the speaker. In fact, we don't have to have a speaker connected, and we can run straight into our recording device or our mixing console. Another limitation with many vintage style amplifiers is that they don't have built-in effects loops. So any time-based effects that we're using, reverb, delay, have to come in front of the amplifier, and this can get muddy or messy sounding. With the Waza Tube Amp Expander, we have built-in delay and built-in reverb, and we can apply that to the signal after the power amp, the same as you would in the studio. Now this gives you the cleanest result and allows you the most control, whether you're working in the studio or you're using those effects live on stage. It's really a great way to use effects because, again, they're coming after that power amp, so the entire signal is being processed. We also have onboard compression if you want to tame dynamics a bit, and there are two different EQ settings. There's a global EQ setting that can apply to the speaker as well as the direct outs that feed into your console, and there's a solo EQ that you engage with this switch or with a foot switch, and that allows you to add a slightly different EQ to your solo sound. So if you want to bring up the bass or make it fatter sounding using that EQ for your solos, you can do that just using this switch in that setting. That solo setting also allows you to adjust the level so you can bump up the volume for your solos as well. But beyond those onboard effects, we also have an effects loop in the Waza Tube Amp Expander itself. So you can insert any effect that you want into the signal path. You can choose between series and parallel effects loop routings, and you can also set the level whether you're working with rack gear or with pedals. Again, that gives you a great deal of flexibility because all that processing comes completely after the amplifier and before the speaker. Now, of course, you're still free to use an effects loop if your amp has one, or if you want to put effects in front of the amplifier, you can do that as well. But this gives you that option to have more studio-style processing going on both live and in the studio. The Waza Tube Amp Expander can take charge of your entire rig. There's built-in MIDI, so you can control it using a MIDI foot switch, and you can also use its MIDI output to switch your effects. So if you have a 2-channel amplifier, a switchable reverb, or vibrato on-off, you can control that using the 1/4-inch out from the Waza Tube Amp Expander. Now all these settings can be stored into what Boss calls a rig. There are 10 rigs available on the unit itself. As we'll see later when we check out the software, you can create a huge library of these and load them in as you need them. All of the settings are stored as a rig except for the reactive load. So you can just turn this knob to select the rig that you want, and all the settings inside the Waza Tube Amp Expander change right there, along with the control outputs, MIDI outputs, the 1/4-inch jack. Everything switches at once. We have control over the various functions inside the Waza Tube Amp Expander from the front panel. Our speaker output level, we can choose the rig. We have reverb control right here on the front. This control sets the line out level, and this is what feeds into your console or your recording if you're going direct. We also have a headphone output with its own volume knob. The 4 switches up here engage the effects loop and turn it off, engage the onboard effects, engage the solo and EQ function, and also allow you to switch the amplifier using the 1/4-inch jack on the back. But to really be able to dig into all the functionality of the Waza Tube Amp Expander, you'll want to use the free editor software. Let's check that out now. It connects up between your computer and the back of the Waza Tube Amp Expander using a USB cable. So I have the Waza Tube Amp Expander editor software running here on my MacBook Pro, again connected by USB to the Waza Tube Amp Expander unit. Everything is laid out with graphics, so it's very easy to see what's happening. We get a very good idea of our signal flow. So let's take a look here. We can see our entire signal path using graphics. So we come into the Waza Tube Amp Expander here. We've got the effects loop on and off here, a signal present indicator, compression, delay, and reverb. Here at the reverb, the signal splits in two to feed 2 simultaneous outputs. The top output feeds to our speaker, so it goes to the power amplifier. We have a separate EQ here, and we can adjust the level for that output independently. We can also adjust the amount of reverb that's feeding each of those outputs. On the bottom leg of the signal path, we have an EQ, a speaker simulator, level control, and then the line outputs. And that would feed to your front of house, to your stage monitors, or to a recorder. Now we can select the various stages in the signal path and edit the functions within those. So if we choose our effects loop, we can turn that on and off. You'll see the switch on the unit indicates that the effects loop is now active, and I can turn it back off. Next in our signal path, we have a compressor, and we can choose to turn that on or off, and we have 2 different options for the types of compressor that we're using. The onboard delay gives us a lot of parameters to dial in exactly the effect that we want. So we can set our delay time, we can actually set that to match up to the BPM of the song, feedback amount, high cut, effects level, direct level. Now we also have modulation available for the delay, we can filter the delay with the different range, and we can invert the phase of the feedback as well, or of the delay. We have several different delays that we can choose from. This is an SDE 3000. We can do a panning delay if we want, that's next up here. We can also do a stereo delay. There are stereo lineouts on the back of the unit for either stage use or to feed front of house or a recorder. So we have a number of different options for the exact type of delay that we want to use. The reverb also gives us a variety of options. We have 2 different rooms, 2 different halls, a plate, and a spring reverb, and again a lot of control over the different parameters. And you can see here we have speaker out, send, and effect level. This affects the amount of reverb that's being fed into our speaker on stage. Here at the end, we have our line out, send, and effect level. That sets the amount of reverb that's blended into the direct out signal. We have a global effect level, and again, a lot of parameters for adjusting the sound of the reverb. If we jump up to the top leg of our signal path, which is the speaker output, we have our solo EQ function. A couple of different types of EQ here. We have a graphic EQ. We also have a parametric EQ. And you can engage this with a foot switch or from the front panel, so you can have that come on just when you're soloing. We also have a level control here, so we can boost the level for solos as well. We have a speaker output level control, signal present, and then the speaker output. Down here on the direct out side of the chain, we have a similar EQ, either graphic or parametric, that's used for the direct outputs. Here we also have a speaker simulator. So we can choose the type of cabinet that we're using, various types of 4x12s, 4x10s, 2x12s, 1x12s, 1x10s, even 1x8s. You can even load in your own user IRs, so you can put in exactly the cabinet that you want to use to get the sound that you're after. We can choose the microphone type. We have 5 different options there. We can set how far the microphone is from the cabinet, and we can also set the position for the microphone. We can choose to use a room mic if we like, small room, anechoic chamber, or a big room. We have a line level control here, and of course signal present, and then the line level output. Now let's compare the sound when we're using a dynamic microphone on the cabinet versus the sound of the cabinet simulator dialed in for a classic 4x12 cabinet with an SM57 dynamic microphone on it. So here's our mic sound. Here's our cabinet simulator. By choosing the type of cabinet that you want, setting up the microphone that you want, and dialing in the reactive load exactly the way that you want it, you can set the response, the feel, and the tone of the amplifier for all your direct recordings and to feed straight into the console live. Now, as I mentioned, you can save all of those settings into a rig, and those are stored over here on the left. And we can also create sets using the librarian function, so you can quickly call up a group of 10 rigs and easily have access to those. We also have some system controls. We have USB settings, MIDI settings, global EQ for the overall sound of the unit, and so on. We can use foot switches with the Waza Tube Amp Expander to call up the different functions and to select rigs. This is great for live use on stage. Two other functions to check out. Our amp control jack is here, so we can set up whether that defaults to on or off. And we also have rig MIDI, which are settings that are stored with each rig, and those are MIDI commands that can be sent out over various channels. Now, there are actually two ways that you can use a Waza Tube Amp Expander. The more traditional way, I guess you'd say, is the way we've been doing it so far, with a very loud amplifier where we're bringing the volume down to make it more manageable at home, in the studio, or even on small stages. But you can also go the other direction. So in this case, I have a Reissue 65 Deluxe, which is a 22-watt amplifier. Great for practice, great for the studio, even great for certain live gigs. But if you're playing with a loud drummer or the band starts cranking up the volume, it's probably not going to keep up. But in this case, we're coming out of the Deluxe into the back of the Waza Tube Amp Expander, and then using the Waza Tube Amp Expander to drive our speaker. And that gives us 100 watts of power. Quite a bit more headroom's available there, so if we need a clean sound that's much louder, we can do it using the Waza Tube Amp Expander. Now, the internal speaker may not be enough in that case, but we could also drive a 4x12 cabinet, for example, if we chose to. And we can set up the reactive load so it feels exactly right no matter what we're doing. This greatly increases the versatility of the Waza Tube Amp Expander, because you can use it with a tiny amplifier for just creating your tone and set the volume exactly where you want it, or go the opposite direction, use a big fire-breathing amplifier, crank it up, and then bring the volume down to where it's more manageable. And again, with the Deluxe, which doesn't have an effects loop, we can add all those effects after the power amplifier and treat them exactly as if they're studio effects. I hope you've enjoyed this look at the Waza Tube Amp Expander. I'm very impressed with this box. When I was first introduced to it, I was very excited to check it out. And now that I've had my hands on it and used it with a couple of different amplifiers, I'm very impressed. Boss has done a great job with it. Definitely check this out. Super useful whether you're in the studio or on stage. Thanks for joining me for Sweetwater's Guitars and Gear. Be sure to tune in next time. We'll have more guitars, more amps, more effects, and we'll be making lots of music. I'm Mitch Gallagher.